Good, and let's go ahead and settle into our meditation posture then for our sit this evening. Composing the body, really sensing the formal practice as a courageous act, this willingness to be right in the middle, alert, relaxed, to some degree at least undefended, open, vulnerable in the sense of feeling what is here to feel moment by moment, not relying on distraction or our habits of disconnection. Even with what is uneven, being balanced with all that's moving in the body, in the mind, in us, around us. So instead of attending to all that is moving, like our thoughts and the sensations and the sounds, see if you can have a sense of what's stable. So for example, the wisdom in our heart that knows not to cling, the wisdom in our heart that knows that it's okay to let go. But that can be quite stable, the letting go, the not clinging. So no matter what's happening, no matter what's arising in the moment, the mind, the heart can know not to cling, not to be attached. And there can be a real steadiness in that non-identification, that non-clinging, that non-attachment. And those of you who've been practicing for a while know that this actually becomes our true refuge. Not some experience, some nice experience, but the not clinging to both nice and the difficult experiences. And we can learn to keep this not clinging, this non-attachment in mind, no matter the thoughts that come and go, or the pleasant sensations or unpleasant sensations in the body. Or let's say we're using a traditional meditation object like awareness of breathing in and breathing out. But with real practice, the object of awareness is more than not clinging to the breath as it comes in, and the non-clinging to the breath as it goes out. The not being attached, the not being identified, not taking the breath personally, even while being aware, being intimate of breathing in and breathing out. What wisdom is really interested in is the not clinging to the breathing process, but just letting nature, the nature of breathing in and the nature of breathing out, just letting nature be nature. And this is the real art of our practice, how to be, on the one hand, intimate with the changing conditions of the breath or the changing conditions of mental activity, without being pushed around, without being caught up with what's changing, what's moving. So there's something that's steady And that steadiness is the non-clinging, is the wisdom of non-grasping, as Ajahn Chah calls it. The wisdom of non-grasping. But this wisdom has to be cultivated. What we know now, the habits of our untrained mind, is to constantly take whatever experience is predominant, to take it personally, to react to it. If we like it, hold on, try to make it last. If we don't like it, push it away, try to make it go away. So right in the middle, bright, clear, unafraid, undefended, taking refuge in this capacity, this refuge of non-grasping, not clinging, this non-entanglement with all that's moving now. And we'll continue in silence for the rest of the sitting time. And we'll be sitting for a few more minutes, but just remembering the theme for this evening, exploring this stability and refuge of non-grasping. So here we are, aware, awake, sensitive to the activity of the body and the mind. But we're practicing keeping in mind this capacity for non-grasping, non-attachment. And we realize non-attachment with the intimacy of whatever's moving, thought, sensation, sound. In other words, learning how to let things be. Unwholesome qualities of mind might arise, but we practice this non-grasping, non-attachment, both with what is unwholesome, but also with what is wholesome and good. This way of practicing is so simple, so no matter what it is that's arising for us, pleasant experience and unpleasant experience, what the heart, what the mind is interested in is the non-grasping, the non-clinging, the not getting attached. And in this way, nature, the conditioned nature of thoughts and sensations and sounds and sights to come and go, it all has permission to come and go. Everything arises and passes away and not worthy of grasping. Nice to be with everyone tonight. Thank you for showing up. So tonight I'd like to talk about the unwholesome roots or the defilements. And yeah, I just find it interesting. I was reading an article, I think it's listed in the resource document. I'll put in the chat again. An article by Ajahn Thanisaro. He's a Buddhist monk and abbot of a monastery outside of San Diego. A Westerner who went to Thailand and practiced for several decades and came back to the West, and a wonderful translator and Dharma teacher. And he has an article about the defilements. And he sort of has an agenda in this article, like how so many Western Dharma teachers, he suggests, are afraid to talk about the defilements. Maybe that students won't be interested in Buddhist practice if there's some overemphasis or emphasis on these afflictive or qualities of the mind that torment us. And he's making this counter argument that it's really central to the practice. And we have to discover for ourselves that these unwholesome, unhelpful, conditioned habits of our mind, that it's impersonal. It's not like I'm bad because I have the tendency to be defensive, or I'm bad because I have the tendency to be aggressive, or I'm bad because I have the tendency to close down, or whatever particular patterns each of us have conditioned in. They're not personal. We pick up these so-called unwholesome, unhelpful qualities through the ordinary conditioning process of being raised by the parents we were raised by, being raised in the culture we were raised in, even our genetic conditioning maybe to some degree. And then we end up with a conditioned mind, a habit-bound mind, like we all do. Different, of course, but so even though it's not personal, we have every reason to take the particular qualities of our mind, like to take responsibility for, let's say, purifying. I mean, that word purifying kind of sounds tight. Oh, you mean I got to purify my mind? Because we can only hear that word in terms of, it's me that's bad, so I need to purify me because I'm bad. And in a way, these unwholesome, unskillful qualities, conditioned habits of our mind, they don't need mercy. They need effective ways for us to unhook from them, to be free of them. Right? If they're truly unhelpful, then they don't need a pass. Like, well, yeah, you're a bad habit, but I don't want to hate you, or I don't want to be mean, so I'm going to let you be there in the background and thrive and take over my mind and lead me into difficult states and maybe even ruin my life, because I'm averse to sort of being that kind of parent, using that sort of parental energy that says, you know what, this isn't for my well-being or anybody's well-being. This is not a helpful pattern of mine. And I'm not going to hate this pattern, but I am going to learn how to not reinforce it, how to not feed it, because it's not helping anybody. It's the same thing, if you're a parent of a child, or if you're somebody with some responsibility for a community, you're going to stamp out what is unhelpful. If you're a firefighter, you're going to put out the fire, and you're going to, how it is in these forest fires. Some of the ways that the fire restarts is the roots, are smoldering there, even under the surface, and they can smolder for a long time, and then when the conditions are right, the blaze can start again. So you're going to do whatever it takes to uproot what is worthy of being uprooted. But we don't talk that much. We don't talk this way that much in terms of spiritual practice. We talk about wanting to just let things be, but we're really here to train the heart or purify the heart. But we want to do it wisely. We don't want to do it in a way that just creates a lot of self-hatred, because that's just more of the defilements, right? Just more of what's not helpful. So how can we purify our heart in a way that's positive, that's onward leading to more release, more wholesome qualities? How can we take care of the business that needs taken care of without making our heart messier and more disturbed and more full of unhelpful qualities? That's really the question. And so maybe the way to begin this is just to ask ourselves, like, just to review the qualities of our mind maybe that we saw today or over the last week or two, wholesome and unwholesome qualities, just various kinds of conceits, for example, thinking we're better than, thinking we're worse than somebody else, patterns of like not caring, not thinking things are important, being disconnected in that way where I don't even care if I'm skillful or unskillful. We can have that nihilistic attitude of mind sometimes, and states of greed, states of hate and aversion, even self-hatred. So then the question is this heart in need of some training? Is this heart, mind in need of some purification? Are we okay with whatever the habits that are alive and well in us, conditioned into our mind? Are we okay with them just sort of running the show or not? It's just a good question. And I'm sure, hopefully, it's a mix, right? There's some qualities of our heart and mind, some habits that are probably not terrible or maybe even quite wholesome. But that's probably not the whole show, right? There's probably some that are not for our well-being and need some help. They need purification. And to even begin this work, we need some degree of moral sensitivity. And that's another word that we have to reform, because when we hear that word moral, we just get tight because we think somebody's going to judge me. Somebody is judging me. Am I good enough? I'm not sure what would be a better word, but one way or another, we have to realize that our heart, right here, this mind, this heart right here, is capable of being morally sensitive to what's skillful and unskillful. And it actually is a good thing, because it makes us independent of thinking that some outside force is going to I need their judgment about what's skillful or unskillful, what's good and what's bad. But in the way the Buddha taught, ethical sensitivity, moral sensitivity, knowing what's right and wrong, it's something here and now in our heart. We just have to learn to listen. It's almost like we're learning to listen to that intuitive or that intuition, that conscious, like having a conscience about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. And it's almost like we're able to taste or feel the quality of the motivation in our heart or the quality of the intention in our mind. How does this feel? I want to say this to this person. Well, how does that intention to want to say this to that person, how does it feel? Does it feel skillful or unskillful or not clear if it's skillful or unskillful? And the Buddha, in a conversation with his son Rahula, when he was just 7 years old, maybe some of you don't know, but before the Buddha became a spiritual seeker, a wandering ascetic, he was married and kind of in a wealthy family that was sort of the leader of fiefdom, a small little area in northern India at the time. And then he got interested in the bigger questions, spiritual questions in life, and left his home and his family, one child and his partner, his wife. But later, when he was a teacher, he cycled back through that part of India, and his former wife, said to him, his son Rahula, "Go see that man." uh, what did she say? Something like, "Oh, ask for your inheritance," something like that. So the little boy, at the time he was just 6 years old, said that to the Buddha. So the Buddha made him a novice monk. That was his inheritance. You get to be a monk. I'll be your teacher. And so Rahula became a monk at a very young age. This is actually, through the centuries, has been the case, and especially early Theravada countries like Thailand and Burma and Sri Lanka, but other countries too. It's families that have a lot of kids would often send one or more of the boys. Usually, some countries there's an active Buddhist nun community, but and they'd get educated at the monastery, and some would then stay and be monks their whole lives, and some would later leave and live as a lay person. But anyway, so the Buddha spoke to his son when he was a novice monk and told him, before you do anything, even think a thought or say some words out loud, speak to somebody, or act in some way, you should reflect. You should contemplate, like, that motive, that intention. Is it for my well-being, for the other's well-being, or for the well-being of both, or not? And if it is, if the sense is, oh yeah, I think this is wholesome, and you then say that, which you were inclined to say or think that or do something, then even while you're acting on, having those thoughts or saying those words or doing that deed, you should also continue to reflect. Because even though initially you thought it was wholesome, you might have been somewhat deluded. So now you're doing it, you're thinking that thought, speaking those words, doing that act, and you're contemplating, is this for my well-being, the well-being of others, the well-being of both me and others? And then even after you've done something, said something, thought something, we should contemplate, was that for my well-being, the well-being of another, the well-being of both me and others? So in other words, all the time we should be contemplating. So it's not about repressing motivations or intentions, not repressing our thoughts or our actions or our words that we speak, but just being interested, like, can we sustain that interest. So we're calling upon our moral sensitivity. How's this feeling? Is it feeling wholesome? And remember, wholesome, it's something very practical. Wholesome just means it's onward leading to release, to freedom, to our heart and the hearts of others not being bound up with suffering. Or is it unwholesome, which means it's onward leading to our hearts getting bound up, getting tight? And we naturally care about whether things are wholesome or unwholesome, but we have to, in a sense, there's so much superficiality and distractedness. And not an encouragement, because like I've mentioned earlier in the talk, there's some aversion and some kind of cultural disrespect for this moral sensitivity, because it can get stinky when it gets linked up with conceit. So I'm being morally sensitive, but I'm this judger, critical person, judging others, judging myself. But it should arise out of compassion, like, how am I going to take care of myself if I don't develop and strengthen and really take as a refuge this moral sensitivity? In a way, we're feeling our way through life. Before we do something, as we're doing something, after we've done something, all day long, we're counting on this moral sensitivity. Is this for my well-being, the well-being of others, the well-being of both, or not? And it gets clearer and stronger the more we use it. And especially because, this is what the continuity of present moment awareness allows for. It really allows for wisdom to comprehend the skillfulness or unskillfulness of action, thoughts, words, and deeds. And in the Buddhist way of thinking, in the Buddhist cosmology, you're not actually a human being unless you're interested and have cultivated this moral sensitivity to some degree. You're not really fully human unless you're interested in some kind of ongoing way in what is skillful and unskillful. And in a way, living your life in alignment to some degree. Obviously, we're all imperfect at this. But like, it matters. Like, I care about. And even, as I'm giving a talk, I don't know, all of you doing what you do in life, as when we're in our role with whatever responsibilities we have as a parent, as a leader, as a business person, as a artist, as a carpenter, whatever we do, where there is some reflective awareness, like, how am I doing? Is what I'm doing helpful or not helpful? Right? So there is this reflectiveness. This is not something foreign to any of us, but we want to highlight it and we want to develop it. It basically make it really fine-tuned and allow it to have its effect. Like I mentioned, the Buddha says, you're not really a human being unless you have that sensitivity. And another image he uses, I don't know if you've seen how fat, like if you put it in a hot skillet, it kind of shrinks. And he says there's this sort of reaction, like when we have that moral sensitivity and something triggers something unwholesome in our heart, there's a reaction like, oh, I don't want to be this kind of person. It's impactful. And it's not, but another day, when we're not morally sensitive and we're distracted and we're living in a more superficial way, being triggered and having greed or having hate or having some conceit manifest in our personality, it won't stand out. We'll just act it out and dig the hole deep, right? We'll just set in motion suffering for ourselves and others because there wasn't that moral sensitivity to protect us. And the Buddha's not shy about like what we need to do. You know, he talks about the 3 wholesome and the 3 unwholesome roots. So the 3 wholesome roots, non-greed, which would be generosity and renunciation, contentedness, and then non-hate would be kindness, and non-delusion would be being clear, being connected. And it implies a kind of humility. We can't really be non-deluded if we think we know. Because if we think we know, we're not really open to the moment. And we can't actually be non-deluded unless we're open and really connecting. Because the present moment isn't an idea, oh, it's like this is what's happening to me. The present moment is, like the Buddha said once, no matter how I conceive it as a concept, the present moment, it will always be other than that. So like what's happening to you now, if you give yourself a verbal answer, I'm on Zoom listening to Mark talk, that's not actually what's happening. I mean, I totally get why we would say that, because the convention is we turn everything into a concept, an idea. But actually the way it is, if we want to connect with the way it is, we don't tell ourselves the way it is, we open. Oh, this is how it is right now. You know, the experience of the body sitting, the experience of the ears hearing, the experience of the mind comprehending what's being heard. The direct immediacy of our experience is the way it is, not my conceptual interpretation, kind of that overlay or that projection. And one of the ways the Buddha would talk about these unwholesome roots is as encircling vines that take over the mind, that sweep us away. He would use sometimes the simile of a flood that sweeps away a village, right? The rain upstream, and then the high waters just sweep away. And these floods, you know, the floods of greed, the floods of becoming, wanting to be somebody, and the conceits of that, the floods of ignorance and fixed views that sweep us away. We just get caught up. And then, you know, the way he described, I want to just read this, because it just that diligence and really wanting to uproot to the nth degree anything that's unwholesome. Why would we, you know, if we understand the power of a seed, like how a little seed can end up being a really big tree that produces tens of thousands of seeds each season, you know, which will lead to more of those big trees and many more thousands of those seeds, and on, all from one seed, right? And it's the same thing with whatever remaining tendency towards greed, hatred, and delusion that exists in our mind. To the degree that our wisdom sees that, the compassionate and wise response in our heart would be, I want to uproot that seed. I don't want it to be there. And the example the Buddha gives, just as if there were a tree smothered and surrounded by parasitic vines. So that was one of the image he uses, the encircling vines, where a vine eventually takes over a whole tree. And you can't even see the original tree because the entire tree is now surrounded by the vine. A person who wants to purify their heart, they'd come along with a spade, a basket, they'd cut the vines at the root, having cut them at the root, would dig around them, having dug around them, they would pull them up, even down to the rootlets. They would cut the stalks of the vines, having cut them, they would slice them into splinters. Having sliced them into splinters, they would pound them into bits Having pounded them into bits, they would dry them in the wind and sun. Having dried them in the wind and sun, they'd burn them in a fire. Having burned them in a fire, they would reduce them to powdered ash. Having reduced them to powdered ash, they would winnow them before a high wind and let them be washed away in a swift flowing stream. In that way, the parasitic vines would have their root destroyed, deprived of the conditions of development, not destined for future arising. Now that's thorough. And can we imagine caring for our heart and the conditioning of our mind with that much respect? Like, I know the power of those seeds for hate, those seeds for greed, those seeds for delusion. So when I see them, to whatever degree I can, I'm going to uproot them. I'm certainly not going to water them. I'm not going to reinforce them. Why would I do that? It's not for my well-being. It's not for the well-being of others. It's not for anybody's well-being. And you know, some of us, we have that vigilance about other things we do in life, you know, like some of you raised children, and you might have been, you know, if some danger existed for your child, you'd probably be pretty persistent, or even your pet, right? To make sure that they're taken care of, so that you can rest at ease. There's nothing that needs to be done to protect my child, or there's nothing right now that needs to be done to protect my dog, or my partner, or my other responsibilities in life that I care about. This is from Ajahn Chah, chapter 45, and that collection of Ajahn Chah talks is linked to in that document in the chat there. We must learn to give up all forms of evil. And just even that is an interesting way to translate, to not be shy when we see an unwholesome quality in our heart, like, oh yeah, that's not good. So you don't have to use the word evil, if it's for whatever reason triggering. But we don't want to pretend that it isn't a problem. We must learn to give up all forms of evil, giving up all those things which are the cause for deep-seated ill will. We conquer ourselves. We don't conquer others. We fight, but we fight only the defilements. If there is greed, we fight that. If there is aversion or hate, we fight that. If there is delusion, we strive to give it up. This is called Dhamma fighting. Yeah, it's kind of provocative. Ajahn Chah continues, this warfare of the heart is really difficult. In fact, it is the most difficult thing of all. We become monks or practitioners in order to contemplate this, to learn the art of fighting greed, aversion, and delusion. This is our prime responsibility. This is the inner battle, fighting with defilements. But there are very few people who fight like this. Most people fight with other things. They rarely fight defilements. They rarely even see them. Now, let's just ask ourselves. I mean, it's kind of shocking, I guess. I'm speaking for myself now. But if we ask ourselves today, how many times today did I clearly see some intention or motivation or force in my mind, in my heart? Did I clearly see it was a defilement, like, oh, this is not good for me, for anybody. This should be abandoned, pulverized, gotten rid of, right? Like with real moral authority, oh yeah, there is just no way I want to feed this pattern in my heart. So how many times today? How many times in the last week or the last month did we have that kind of moral clarity arising out of self-compassion, like really wanting to take care of ourselves, take care of this life. And, this is what the Buddha, basically it's the translation of what the last words of the Buddha before he died. This vigilance, the appamada is the Pali word, that we should have that kind of wakeful, vigilant sensitivity to what's skillful and unskillful. Practice with vigilance. Be really sensitive about what's skillful and unskillful for your own well-being, for your own awakening, for your own freedom and the freedom of others. Don't go back to sleep. Don't go back to living a superficial, distracted existence. It really matters. So in our tradition, early Buddhist tradition, Theravada Buddhism, this is sort of the first major insight on the path is just understanding that my heart knows the difference between what's skillful and unskillful. And I'm very happy about that. And I'm not going to forget that sensitivity. I'm grateful for that sensitivity. This is what Ajahn Chah says about that. The Buddha taught us to give up all forms of evil and to cultivate virtue. This is the right path. Teaching in this way is like the Buddha picking us up and placing us at the beginning of the path. Having reached the path, whether we walk along it or not, it's up to us. The Buddha's job is finished right there. He shows us the way, that which is right, that which is not right. This much is enough. The rest is up to us. Right? So like the Buddhist teachings to stabilize present moment awareness and all the other teachings, it creates the situation where in any moment of our life, we can directly, independently discern, oh, this feels unskillful, not for my well-being or the well-being of others. Or this way of speaking or thinking or doing things feels skillful in the direction of release, in the direction of what's wholesome for me, for others. And then it's up to us to stay sensitive and to let that moral sensitivity be our guide, in a sense. Show us the way. And that's that constant recollection. Like over time, we're so grateful to keep reflecting, is this for my well-being, the well-being of others, the well-being of both? It's not like a burden. It's like the same thing if you're driving somewhere and you would want to keep recollecting, am I going in the right direction? Am I driving safely? Right? Because we don't want to be sloppy and end up in an accident or end up in the wrong place. We keep recollecting, is this the right way to be driving, the right place to be driving? And everything else about our functional lives, we have that ongoing recollectedness. And so the Buddha is just saying, yeah, we need that in this most important place. Because without that recollectedness about whether something, this way of relating, is wholesome or not wholesome, we're going to cultivate a heart that nobody wants to be around, including ourselves. That's another way to think about it is, when I die, or when I really need, like in a challenging moment of life, am I cultivating the heart that will be a good friend for me? How can I right now, in every moment of my life, be cultivating a heart that I'm going to be really grateful for when I'm around my loved one who's dying, or around my own dying process, or facing some challenging moment in my life? What kind of heart will be really valuable? Well, why don't I cultivate that heart now, moment by moment, planting the seeds and uprooting the seeds that aren't going to lead there, planting the seeds that do lead there. And so we're planting seeds for happiness, but more importantly, we're planting seeds for full release, for freedom. So when we're spinning with doubt or we're indulging in, you know, restlessness or, you know, cynicism or hating, it's like sometimes the way we read the news, it's just a way of cultivating self-righteous rage, as if that's onward leading. It's good medicine or something, leading where to, and so just to ask that question, like when we look at the kind of seeds that are being planted, where does this lead? What kind of person am I becoming? Is this heart becoming? Is that where I want to go? Well, why would I be planting these seeds if I don't want to go where these seeds go? What seeds might I plant? Well, I could start with maybe forgiveness for being unskillful. Oh yeah, those are good seeds to plant, you know. Maybe I could redirect my heart in another direction. How can I take care of myself? But the most important thing is this moral sensitivity. And I mentioned this sutta, this discourse a lot. It's translated as two kinds of thinking or two sorts of thinking. It's the middle length discourses, if you want to look it up. The middle length discourse is number 19, two sorts of thinking. And basically, the Buddha was telling his students, before my deep insight, my awakening, the way I practice, it occurred to me, why don't I observe my thinking, how my mind is relating, and just divide it into what's skillful and unskillful. And then this is the translation, and as I remained thus heedful, ardent, resolute, thinking imbued with greed and ill will and harmfulness arose in me. I like that. Like, here it is, the Buddha practicing, ardent, heedful, right? So he's practicing really well, and yet greed, hatred, and delusion arose in him, right? And what his practice in that moment was, I discern that thinking imbued with greed, if that was what was arising in that moment, it obstructs discernment, it promotes vexation, it does not lead to unbinding and release. And when I noticed that, all of that, then it subsided. Whenever thinking imbued with greed or hatred or harmfulness had arisen, I simply abandoned it, dispelled it, wiped it out of existence. How? He told us, by noticing that it's unskillful, not by hating it, not by being embarrassed, but just noticing that it's not helping. Oh, this isn't helping. And you can even use that language internally in your heart, like when you see yourself caught up in a way, instead of getting tight about it, just understand, oh, this isn't helping anybody. It isn't helping me. So it's really a compassionate response. And notice if we keep in mind that it's not helping, does it fall away on its own? Can we continue to act out in an unskillful way while at the same time noticing that it's not helping, not onward leading for me or for anyone? And that we can check out for ourselves. Like if we're spending money we don't really have, we're on Amazon.com and buying things that, maybe better uses for the money. And we just see that quality in the heart. And it just occurs to us, is this helpful? What's getting set in motion here? Obviously we don't like to take to undermine the habits of mind because we wrongly take those habits to be personal. They're real, those habits. They're our responsibility, but they're not, in a sense, who we are. It's a conditioned pattern. Is it helpful? Right? So it's really okay to have this sort of pragmatic relationship with it. Is it helping? If it's not helping, I'm not going to tell myself a lie and pretend that I need this or that this is what I should be doing now. I'm going to instead be aware this is not helpful. This is not what I need to be doing right now. Because that's what my heart is telling me. That's what wisdom is saying. And the Buddha says, when the mind was relating in an unskillful way, if I just kept that in mind, this is unskillful, it faded, it went away. It was a way of wiping it out of existence, simply by being aware of its unskillfulness. I recommend we really check that out. It is a dharma superpower. I mean, we all have that question with our own addictive patterns, whatever they might be. And so what's the magic to being free of our afflictive patterns that torment us? Keep in mind its unskillfulness. We have to be steadfast, we have to be courageous, we have to be patient. We're not trying to make it go away, in a sense. Wisdom realizes the way it does go away is by keeping in mind its unwholesome nature. Keep seeing this is not for my well-being, the well-being of others, the well-being of both. It is a seed that doesn't go anywhere good. We just have to keep seeing that. And it really does take courage initially. Our instinct is to get in there and destroy it, but it's sort of what happens then is we're using another unskillful quality of mind to take care of an unskillful quality of mind. And we often just dig the hole deeper. And then in that same discourse, the two sorts of thinking, the Buddha talks about wholesome qualities. And the same thing, that reflectiveness, that moral sensitivity is also going to be there. We want it just as much to be there when a wholesome way of relating shows up for us. And then we contemplate before and during and after any thinking, speaking, or acting. Is this for my well-being, the well-being of others, or both? And then the intuition is, yeah, this feels pretty wholesome. This feels onward leading. And while we're doing it and after we're doing it. And when this happens, the Buddha talks about the happiness and well-being that comes, right? It's energizing when we notice that the mind is relating in a wholesome way, the mind has been relating in a wholesome way. It creates its own positive feedback loop. That brightness, that energy. People wonder, how do we access joy in life, a trustworthy joy in life? Seeing the good is the best way, right? Seeing the good, not just even in our own heart, but we can recognize it in another person's heart too, right? This is one of the joys for me. I'm not proud of the movies and TV that I watch. Not that I think it's terrible, but often the kind of programs I watch is I'm delighted by observing people being good. So you see somebody doing something that's healing or doing something that's generous or doing something that's courageous, and my heart delights in it. And it delights, how movies are simplistic generally, and so people who do good things usually happen to them, it sets good in motion. And just like that, the lawfulness of that, just like often in movies and programs too, we see people acting with greed or acting with hate, and we see bad things happening to them. And humans have been telling stories, these moral stories, since the beginning of time. And our heart delights because this is what makes us truly human, is we're sensitive to what is wholesome and unwholesome. And so spiritual practice is just to be conscious of this natural capacity we have to be morally sensitive, and just riding it to the nth degree. Because it gets really subtle how greed and aversion operate in our mind, and how kindness and generosity and clarity, all the wholesome qualities can operate. We want to develop the sensitivity so we're like the Buddha described, all the subtle tendencies have been completely uprooted. All the little rootlets, all the seeds that are remaining are seen and pulverized and washed away, so there's no more becoming. And that's really the definition of an awakened one. It's not that they understand the experience of freedom, right? You can have moments of real freedom, the freedom of a Buddha, but there still may be latent tendencies for greed and hatred and delusion that can then cloud the mind again later. So a fully awakened one is somebody who not only has experienced moments of freedom, but has done the very arduous work of finding and uprooting all the latent tendencies for greed, hatred, and delusion. So that no matter what trigger might show up in your life, you're not going to get overwhelmed by greed, hatred, and delusion. Those tendencies have been uprooted. So let me leave it here because it'd be nice to hear from some of you, as I'm sure you feel too. I really appreciate people's willingness to share what you've been learning in your practice or questions that are emerging. And people can just unmute themselves, introduce yourself with your first name if you don't mind. You can share your pronouns if you want, and maybe where you're coming in from. Yeah, anybody have willingness to share or ask a question? Yeah, Freda.
Yeah, this is, I hope you don't mind the way I'm framing this, but you talked about watching movies and television, and you mentioned that from time to time. So uh, it's like, okay, we do these things because, you know, you can't be serious all the time. And even when I was at Upandita's Forest Refuge, the staff there was watching television, some of the Burmese staff. But how do you work with, like, do you give yourself permission, or you ration yourself, or do you feel guilty, or how do you deal with it? Is that too personal?
No, I know it's really appropriate because these are real questions, our relationship with media. But what we know, what I know, and I'm assuming you know too, Freda, is like the mind, it isn't, if I could just control my mind and do what I think is best, I would, but I can't. The mind is going to do what it's going to do. But what I can, like in terms of watching one more episode when I really should be going to bed or doing some work or whatever, the mind is going to do what it's going to do, but we can take our practice along. So I think the way to work with it isn't, I mean, some of you might be good at disciplining, say, okay, I'm only going to do this or I'm only going to do that. And so we'll use those sort of strategies. But a more foundational strategy, I think, well, at least that I found in my own life, is that I'll tell myself, do whatever you're going to do, Mark. Eat whatever you're going to eat, watch whatever you're going to watch, say whatever you're going to say, don't do whatever you're not going to do. But the practice goes along. That's really the key. It's like, but I'm going to be there. Wisdom, awareness is going to come along for the ride. So we're shifting from that parental energy that's basically, I'm going to create a schedule for you, Mark, and you better follow it or you're going to go to hell. So instead of that strategy, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, it's like, well, things are going to be the way they're going to be. And maybe in some moments you'll be parental, and some moments you'll be the rebel, and you're going to do whatever you want to do, and no one's going to tell you to do otherwise. right? So I'm just letting all that be, the conditioning, the tendencies of my mind, but I'm cultivating this tendency of my mind to be interested in this morally sensitive way, knowing what's skillful and unskillful, and applying it as I do whatever I do, right? And so that's exactly what happens, that moral consciousness will keep re-emerging, and it will have its effect. So I don't have to emerge as a person who has to control Mark's habit energies, right? It's like the Buddha's in that discourse, Two Kinds of Thoughts. What he discovered is simply keeping the unskillfulness in mind, not thinking about it, not thinking that I'm bad, but just like, how is this? I'm watching TV. How is this? What's it feel like? And trusting that if it's really unskillful, then that will cause a change, a shift in the behavior. Yeah, somebody named Ladybugs. Do you want to just unmute yourself?
Hi, I'm Jessica. That's my family name because more people use the Zoom than just me. Um, I I know I'm going to do not a good job phrasing this, but you talked about like the grasping and the clinging and unskillful versus skillful, and I just read an article, and news can bring up certain things, but I was reading that um, the leader right now of the Supreme Patriarch didn't shake Kamala Harris's hand. And I don't know much about, sorry, I'm also sick, so I'm going to do my best to talk through a cold. Um, but is, so then I started looking into it because I've been studying Buddhism with you, Mark, for like 10 years, but I haven't gone into the role of women. Obviously, the Buddha has said some uh, what I would say would be very unskillful or unwholesome things about women. And I recognize that that can exist within a time. But those are deep seeds planted. And even when I looked into the monks and then the Supreme Patriarchy, it actually is the Supreme Patriarchy, so it's all men. Um, Maybe you could talk about that, or I personally find it problematic. I don't know if anybody else does. To me, that's a huge what did you call it, like poisonous vine. um, how do we uproot that, and how do we find that curiosity? Where what am let's see, what did I take a little notes on, but just I'm probably doing a terrible job, but I'm just, if anybody has anything else with that, or yeah, I'm just interested because I I find that to be very problematic in our world, and it's just seeds that are continually watered, and and obviously still exist within Buddhism today. So those haven't been uprooted, and even what the Buddha said, um, it wasn't necessarily a positive view of women. So maybe you could talk about that. I'm just having a lot of problems with it. I'm like, maybe I don't want to pursue this path if these are seeds that are still being planted. If um, the Supreme Patriarch won't shake Kamala Harris's hand, why is that? I would ask myself why the curiosity. But the article was also pointing to the sexism and the misogyny that exists. And I,
Yeah. Well, Buddhist institutions, like a lot around the world, are often patriarchal and have a long history of that. So I think that's just the nature of, unfortunately, the nature of so many of the institutions on the planet right now. So that's definitely true. That, and I'm not sure who you mean by the Supreme Patriarch, but nuns shouldn't be touching males. I mean, this is just part of the monastic code, and monks shouldn't be touching females. That's just, so if it were a Theravada monk, they wouldn't touch a female, or a Theravada nun wouldn't touch a male. Um, so that's just part of the monastic culture. It's not have physical contact with someone you're sexually attracted to or something like that. But I'm not, it is troublesome, and I think it's appropriate to feel troubled by the history. And I think in terms of our current manifestation of Buddhism here in the West, I think people should look carefully at the organizations and the structures that you're learning from. I mean, the Buddha says as much. You should observe your teachers before you listen to them and see, are they acting out greed? Are they acting out hate? Are they acting out delusion? Because if they are, why would we listen to them? So I think that's exactly right. But if you hear something that makes sense and that lines up with your own experience, then the whole point is to become independent so we're not dependent on institutions. Doesn't mean we stop learning, but we're developing our own internal, this is like the whole talk was about this independence, like the moral sensitivity doesn't come from outside us, it's here. Now, it doesn't mean that people who are motivated shouldn't get involved in making things better in terms of how institutions function and the issues of fairness and justice. I think that's an appropriate thing for people to dig into. It's certainly something we care a lot about at Common Ground, and people should look at how Common Ground operates, and if there are problems, please let us, if you think there are problems, please let us know. Any other thoughts about that, Jessica?
I guess my last thing is then would being man or woman be fixed? Because that seems to be that seems to go directly against this idea of emptiness or the sense of self. Because so is it really fixed? Because as we know, like gender is fluid and it's not a fixed thing. And even if we are to re-become and get, I was reading some of the things that were said. I'm like, oh, yes, he'll be born as a woman next life. That was just my own, like, yep, because that'll be the course of things, just to, and obviously we don't know, but what about sex and gender, and what about the fixedness, and that seems to be clinging too, because as we know, that can change, and same with gender, that can change within a day. So I was just
yeah, it's just that in our messy, imperfect world, they were trying to create communities that could exist harmoniously, where people could be devoted to spiritual practice imperfectly. Obviously, gender exists along a continuum, and but people are doing the best they can in these imperfect cultural structures to, like, how do you create spiritual community? I'm not saying they got it right. I'm just saying it's not easy to create spiritual community that can survive over time and really create the conditions where people can practice and awaken. But no, you're absolutely right. And the Buddha said as much about all this stuff on the surface is just stuff on the surface, including things like gender or any identity. And at the time, it was pretty radical, like the Buddha said, and we'll have to end it here just because we're a couple minutes over. But just to be clear, and I'm not sure, what you're referring to when you're talking about what you've read, but the Buddha was very clear that women have the same capacity to awaken as men do. And who knows what really happened, because the teachings got passed down for so many centuries. We have to kind of keep an open mind about what was actually said. And it got passed down in really patriarchal cultures for all those centuries. So, but what we do know is the Buddha allowed women to form religious community at the time. And a lot of women had full awakening at the time and became great teachers. But they existed in a very patriarchal culture. And so the way those monastic institutions operated expressed that imbalance at the time, and still do today. Yeah, in some countries more than others. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Jessica. It's really important that we not be afraid to talk about these things. Okay, folks, we should probably end it here. We're a few minutes over. Thanks so much. And by the way, Madhuri Shores and Jen Racho and I will be teaching a workshop this Saturday, 9:30 to 4, on some of the Buddhist teachings on spiritual friendship. So join in for that, both on Zoom and in person at the City Center in Minneapolis. Hope to see some of you there. Lots of other programs coming up in the weeks ahead, so check the public calendar online. And feel free to unmute yourself if you want to say hello before we all sign off.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night.
you.